A man threw her puppy from the 14th floor. What happened next is heartbreaking, a fall from the sky. The night was heavy, the kind of heavy that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. New York City stretched out beneath a sky that didn't sparkle. Not tonight. No stars pierced through the thick grey blanket above, only the faint glow of streetlights, flickering like tired eyes on the wet pavement below. It was nearly midnight in Williamsburg, and from the 14th floor of a steel and glass tower, the world looked deceptively still. Quiet, yes, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hums with secrets, the kind that hides something jagged just beneath the surface. Up there, in apartment 14B, a tiny heartbeat stirred. He wasn't a bird, not a leaf carried off by the wind, but a living thing, small, fragile, wrapped in golden fur that shimmered even in the dim light of fairy lights strung along the balcony window. His name was Saul, a golden retriever puppy, just 10 weeks old, with paws too big for his body and eyes that held a quiet, endless curiosity. He slept in a wicker basket near the sliding glass door, nestled under a blue knit blanket, his soft breaths rising and falling like the tide of a gentler world. He didn't know danger, not yet. He couldn't imagine it wearing a human face, slipping through the cracks of a life he'd only just begun to trust. Down below, the city murmured its usual song, taxi brakes hissing, a distant siren wailing, the low hum of lives brushing past one another without ever truly touching. But up here, on the 14th floor, something darker was unfolding. The door creaked open, not with the familiar softness of the woman who'd brought him home, but with a shadow that moved too quietly, too deliberately. Dante Mears stepped inside, his long wool coat brushing the floor, his blonde hair slicked back with a precision that matched the coldness in his ice-blue eyes. He wasn't here to stay. He wasn't here to mend what he'd broken. He was here because something inside him had snapped, a brittle thread of control that had once tethered him to the woman he'd claimed to love. Serafina wasn't home. She'd stepped out into the night, her slender frame wrapped in a coat too thin for the winter chill, her mind tangled in the exhaustion that sleep couldn't unravel. She'd meant to lock the door, she always did, but tonight her hands had trembled, her thoughts had drifted, and the latch stayed unturned. She'd only gone for oat crackers and almond milk, a small errand to fill the silence of a life she was trying to piece back together. She didn't know that in her absence the sanctuary she'd built would crack open, that the tiny heartbeat she'd begun to lean on would be torn from her. Dante's boots clicked against the hardwood as he crossed the room. The fairy lights cast a soft glow across his face, but there was no warmth in it. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists, and when his eyes fell on Saul's basket, something twisted inside him, a bitter, ugly thing that whispered she'd replaced him. With a dog. A dog. He didn't see the innocence in those floppy ears, or the trust in that cinnamon-swirled fur. He saw a rival, a symbol of everything he'd lost, everything he couldn't control. He reached down, not gently, not with care. His fingers closed around Saul's scruff, lifting him the way you'd pick up trash, something unwanted, something to be discarded. Saul stirred, letting out a startled yip, a sound so small it barely pierced the silence. But Dante didn't pause, didn't flinch. He slid the balcony door open, stepped into the cold, and walked to the edge. The city sprawled beneath him, a sea of lights and shadows, indifferent to the life trembling in his grasp. And then, without a word, without a glance, he let go. Saul fell, a blur of cream against the charcoal sky, a tiny heartbeat plummeting through the night. He didn't flail, didn't cry out, just fell, fast and direct, like a stone dropped into a well. The wind swallowed him, the darkness claimed him, and for a moment it seemed the world would too. 14 stories is a long way down. Too long for something so small, so new. Too long for a heart that had only just learned to beat with trust. But this isn't where the story ends, it's where it begins, because somewhere below, in the quiet chaos of a Brooklyn street, someone was watching, someone was waiting, not with a net, not with a plan, but with a heart that couldn't turn away. A man named Orin, broad-shouldered and scarred, a firefighter who'd seen too much but still carried a flicker of something unbroken inside him. He didn't know what was falling, not yet. He only saw a blur, a streak of pale gold cutting through the night like a comet with no flame. And in that split second, something in him moved, something older than thought, deeper than fear. He dove, arms outstretched, breath caught in his throat. He dove into the cold, into the unknown, chasing a life he didn't even understand. The ground rushed up to meet him, hard and unforgiving, but his hands found something soft, something warm. A trembling weight collided into his chest, and when he hit the pavement, shoulder first, pain jolting down his spine, he held on to that tiny heartbeat, that golden fur, that fragile miracle that shouldn't have survived but did. Saul whimpered, a broken little sound that cracked the night open. Orin sat up slowly, his thick, fireproof coat falling away to reveal the puppy cradled in his arms, blood-smeared, shivering, but alive. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice rough with awe, with disbelief. Above them the tower loomed, a silent witness to an act so cruel it defied reason. Why would anyone do this? Who could toss a life away like garbage? And yet here was the answer, trembling against Orin's chest, a heartbeat that refused to stop. This was no ordinary fall. It was a test of faith, of humanity, of the thin thread that binds us to one another. And what happened next would break your heart, yes, but then stitch it back together, piece by aching piece. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments when the sky itself seems to betray us, there are hands waiting to catch what falls. Hands that remind us the world isn't all shadows, not yet. The weight of winter. Brooklyn wore winter like an old coat that night, frayed at the edges, patched with stubborn grit, and clinging to the bones of the city despite the wind's best efforts to tear it loose. The sky hung low, not with the promise of snow, but with a grey stillness that seemed to hold its breath, thick and expectant, as if it knew something the streets below did not. It was late, nearly midnight, and the city's pulse had slowed to a murmur. Streetlights flickered over wet pavement, casting pools of amber that shivered with every passing gust. Taxi brakes hissed at corners, their sharp exhales swallowed by the damp air, while the distant hum of life softened into something watchful, something waiting. Up on the 14th floor of a Williamsburg high-rise where steel and glass cut sharp silhouettes against the gloom, Sarafina Lauren sat alone. The apartment, 14B, was a small island of warmth in the cold expanse of the city, its walls lined with fairy lights that twinkled like stars she couldn't see outside. She was cross-legged on the couch, her slender frame folded into itself, her narrow shoulders hunched, as though carrying a weight no one could name. Her thick black hair spilled loosely down one side in a braid she hadn't bothered to tighten, and her pale green eyes drifted, not from boredom but from a habit carved deep by years of looking for danger before it arrived. At 28, she was already exhausted, in a way sleep couldn't touch, a bone-deep weariness that clung to her like damp wool. The fairy lights danced faintly against the balcony window, their glow catching on the glass and throwing soft shadows across her face. She wore no makeup, not out of defiance, but because she'd long stopped trying to paint over the fragility she felt inside. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the hem of an oversized sweater, and every so often her gaze flicked to the door. It was locked. She'd checked it twice. Or had she? Doubt gnawed at her, a quiet companion she couldn't shake, born from months of erosion she hadn't seen coming until it was too late. Outside, the city stretched on, vast and indifferent. From up here, everything looked quiet, deceptively so. The wet streets gleamed like ink, reflecting the lights of a world that kept moving while she sat still. She could hear the faint whine of a siren somewhere far off, the low rumble of a subway beneath the earth, but they felt distant, like echoes from someone else's life. Inside, the silence was louder. It pressed against her ears, heavy with the absence of something she couldn't name yet, something small, warm, alive. She didn't know that in a few short hours that absence would have a shape, a name, a heartbeat she'd only just begun to hold close. Serafina shifted, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. She'd been meaning to make soup, something simple, something to fill the hollow spaces, but the thought of standing, of moving, felt like too much. Her mind drifted instead, circling back to the cracks in her life she'd tried to plaster over. She was a lighting designer by trade, a weaver of atmospheres, someone who could coax warmth from shadows and magic from bare bulbs. She'd lit stage shows, galleries, the occasional indie film set, her hands steady as they shaped glows and cast subtleties that made audiences feel without knowing why. But here, in the dim glow of her own apartment, she couldn't find the light she needed. The truth she'd buried loomed too large, too close, and she lacked the strength to face it head-on. That truth had a name. Dante. He'd been a flame once, bright and magnetic, drawing her in with ice-blue eyes and a smile that promised safety. But flames burn, and his had turned cold, then sharp, then cruel. She'd stayed too long, months longer than she should have, clinging to the embers of who he'd been in the beginning. 3 nights ago she'd said enough. After he'd shattered a wine glass against the wall and spat worthless at her for the 3rd time that week, she'd told him it was over. Her voice had trembled, but it held. He'd left, and she hadn't seen him since. The locks stayed the same, though. She hadn't changed them. Not yet. Now, sitting in the stillness, she felt the echo of that decision ripple through her. She should have done it sooner. She should have seen the signs, the way his compliments twisted into control, the way his questions became accusations, the way his anger lingered like smoke long after he'd gone. Her pale green eyes drifted to the balcony window again, catching the faint reflection of herself in the glass. A woman who looked smaller than she remembered, a woman who'd spent too long watching for the next blow. The night deepened outside, the grey stillness thickening into something heavier, something that seemed to press against the walls of 14B. Serafina didn't move. She didn't know that in her absence, soon, too soon, the door she'd forgotten to secure would swing open to a shadow darker than the night itself. She didn't know that the tiny heartbeat sleeping by the balcony, the one she'd named Saul, would be torn from her in a way she couldn't yet imagine. But the city knew, the stillness knew. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between breaths, fate was already shifting, ready to catch what would fall. Shadows of a fading light. Serafina Lauren sat in the dim glow of her Williamsburg apartment, the fairy lights along the balcony window casting a fragile halo around her. At 28, she carried a weariness that felt older than her years, a quiet ache that settled into her bones and refused to leave. Her slender frame curled into the couch, her narrow shoulders tense beneath an oversized sweater, as if braced for a storm she couldn't see but always felt. Her thick black hair hung in a loose braid over one shoulder, strands slipping free like threads of a life she couldn't quite hold together. Her pale green eyes, sharp, watchful, drifted to the glass, catching her reflection. a woman who'd stopped trying to decorate the cracks she wore inside. She wasn't always like this. Once she'd been a spark, a lighting designer with a gift for weaving magic from shadows. Her hands had shaped subtle glows for stage shows, painted galleries with warmth, breathed life into small film sets with carefully cast light. She understood atmosphere, the way a flicker could shift a mood or a beam could reveal a truth. Clients called her intuitive, even brilliant, but in her own life that brilliance faltered. The truth she couldn't illuminate was the one she lived every day. She'd stayed with Dante Mears far longer than she should have, tethered to a man whose light had turned to ash. Dante had been a revelation at first. In his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with a quiet power that drew eyes without effort. His ice-blue gaze could pierce through a room, and his square jaw gave him the kind of trustworthiness people assumed rather than questioned. When they met, he'd made her feel like the only star in his sky, his voice low and warm, his compliments wrapping around her like a promise. "You're radiant," he'd said once, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she'd believed him. For a while she'd glowed in his orbit, her days brighter because he was there. But radiance fades when it's controlled. Over the months, his warmth sharpened into something else. Compliments twisted into possessiveness. Where were you? Who were you with? Until every question felt like a cage closing tighter. His laughter, once a melody, grew edges that cut. She'd catch him watching her, not with love, but with calculation, as if measuring how much of her he could claim. The first time his anger turned cold, she'd flinched, not from a blow, but from the way he'd looked at her, like she was nothing. "You're lucky I bother," he'd said, his voice flat, and the words sank into her, heavy and unshakable. Then came the violence, not fists, not yet, but a force all its own. He'd slam doors until the walls trembled, shatter glasses in fits of rage that left her sweeping up shards in silence. 3 nights ago it reached a breaking point. They'd argued, something small, a forgotten call, and his temper flared like a match struck too hard. The wine glass hit the floor first, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces, and then his words followed, "Worthless, you're worthless." It wasn't the first time he'd said it that week, but it was the last. Her voice, small but steady, cut through the haze. "It's over." He'd stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes glinting with something dangerous, before storming out into the night. She hadn't seen him since. Now, alone in apartment 14B, Sarafina felt the echo of that moment ripple through her. She'd meant it. She was done, but the weight of him lingered, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her pale green eyes drifted to the door, locked tonight, though doubt whispered she'd missed something. She should have changed the locks. She should have done it the next morning, when the silence felt too loud. But her hands had trembled too much, her mind too tangled in the what-ifs. What if he came back? What if he didn't? She hated that she still wondered, hated that a part of her still feared the quiet more than his chaos. She shifted, her fingers tracing the couch's worn fabric, and her gaze fell to the wicker basket by the balcony. Saul slept there, a golden retriever puppy she'd adopted just a week ago, a small, warm heartbeat that had begun to stitch her back together. His creamy fur glowed faintly under the fairy lights, a cinnamon swirl curling along his back, and his oversized paws twitched in dreams she couldn't fathom. He was her light now, fragile but real, and she clung to him in ways she couldn't yet name. The night pressed on, heavy and still. She'd been debating soup, something to fill the hollow ache, but the thought of moving felt too far away. Instead, she stood, her coat too thin against the winter chill, and decided on a quick trip to the bodega. Oat crackers, almond milk, small things to hold her steady. She slipped on her shoes, her hand hesitating at the door. She didn't check the lock this time, didn't think to. The air outside bit at her skin as she stepped into the hall, unaware that the life she'd left behind was about to fracture in a way she'd never recover from alone. A fragile quiet. The night draped Brooklyn in a shroud of grey, a stillness so thick it felt like the city was holding its breath. Up in apartment 14B, the fairy lights glowed softly, their delicate dance casting a warm halo over the room, a fragile shield against the cold pressing against the balcony window. Seraphina Loren stood by the door, her slender frame swallowed by a coat too thin for the winter bite. Her pale green eyes flickered with a quiet resolve, though her hands trembled as she pulled on her shoes. She'd been wrestling with herself all evening, soup or no soup, stay or go, and finally settled on a quick trip to the corner bodega. Oat crackers, almond milk, small anchors to steady the unmoored ache inside her. She paused, her fingers brushing the doorknob, and glanced back at the wicker basket near the balcony. There, beneath a blue knit blanket, slept Saul, a golden retriever puppy just 10 weeks old who'd stumbled into her life like a gift she hadn't known she needed. His creamy fur shimmered in the soft light, the color of warm sand, with a cinnamon swirl curling down his back like a whispered promise. His ears flopped over his 2 big paws, and his round, curious eyes, now closed in sleep, had a way of studying the world with a trust she envied. He was the smallest of his litter, the shelter volunteer had said, quiet and cautious, but endlessly tender. Since she'd brought him home, he hadn't barked once, just followed her with silent devotion, curling up at her feet or nuzzling her side when the tears came. Seraphina's chest tightened as she watched him, his tiny body rising and falling with each soft breath. He twitched once, lost in puppy dreams, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. He was her light now, a heartbeat to hold on to after months of darkness. She'd only had him a week, but already he felt like a piece of her, something pure in a life that had grown too jagged. "I'll be quick," she whispered, more to herself than to him, and stepped into the hall. The door clicked shut behind her, but in her haste, her exhaustion, she didn't turn the lock. She didn't feel the weight of that mistake, not yet. The elevator hummed as it carried her down, the cold seeping through her coat as she stepped onto the wet pavement. The street lights flickered above, their amber glow pooling like tears on the ground, and the distant hiss of taxi brakes faded into the night. She pulled her braid tighter against the wind, her mind drifting as she walked, 5 blocks to the bodega, 5 blocks back. She didn't know that back in 14B the quiet she'd left behind was about to shatter. Inside the apartment, Saul slept on, oblivious to the shadows slipping through the cracks. The door creaked open, not with Seraphina's gentle hesitance, but with a purpose that cut through the stillness like a blade. Dante Mears stepped inside, his long wool coat brushing the floor, his blonde hair slicked back with the same precision that sharpened his every move. His ice-blue eyes glinted in the fairy light, cold and unyielding, and his jaw clenched tight as he scanned the room. The air shifted with him, growing heavier, darker, as if the walls themselves sensed the storm he carried. He wasn't supposed to be here. 3 nights ago, Seraphina had ended it, her voice trembling but firm, her words slicing through the haze of his rage. He'd left then, his silence more threatening than his shouts, and she'd thought, hoped, that was the end. But Dante didn't let go so easily, not of her, not of the control he'd wielded like a leash. His boots clicked against the hardwood, deliberate and slow, as he moved deeper into the space she'd reclaimed. His photos were gone from the shelves, his spare clothes vanished from the closet, even the cologne bottle she'd once kept for him discarded. In their place were fairy lights, a dog bed, a wicker basket, a life he hadn't been invited into. Saul stirred slightly, his tail wagging once in his sleep, a faint recognition of a scent he'd met before. He didn't open his eyes, he didn't know danger. Not yet. He couldn't imagine it wearing a face like Dante's, tall and broad-shouldered, a man who'd once been magnetic but now radiated something sharp, something hollow. Dante's gaze landed on the basket and his lips twisted into a sneer. A dog. That's what she'd replaced him with, a dog. The thought burned through him, bitter and ugly, igniting a rage he'd carried since the night she'd dared to walk away. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Saul like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. The puppy didn't wake, not fully, just shifted beneath the blanket, his tiny heartbeat steady in the quiet. Dante's hands clenched into fists, then unclenched, and for a moment the room held its breath. Outside, Serafina turned the corner toward the bodega, her footsteps quickening against the wind. She didn't know that the light she'd left behind was about to be torn from her, that the fragile peace she'd found was already slipping through her fingers. The edge of cruelty. The air in apartment 14B hung heavy, laced with the faint hum of fairy lights that traced the balcony window like a fragile lifeline. The night outside pressed against the glass, a grey stillness swallowing Brooklyn whole, muffling the distant hiss of tires and the low wail of a siren fading into the dark. Inside, the silence was softer, warmer, cradling a tiny heartbeat nestled in a wicker basket by the sliding door. Saul, a golden retriever puppy just 10 weeks old, slept beneath a blue knit blanket, his creamy fur glowing faintly in the dim light. A cinnamon swirl curled along his back, his floppy ears spilled over paws too big for his small frame, and his chest rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of dreams, dreams of chasing shadows perhaps, or curling closer to the woman who'd given him a home. Serafina was gone, her slender figure lost to the winter night, her coat too thin as she hurried toward the bodega 5 blocks away. She'd left the door unlocked, unintentionally, unknowingly, her mind tangled in the exhaustion that clung to her like damp cloth. She didn't feel the crack she'd left behind, the space where something darker could slip through, and slip through it did. The door creaked open, not with her hesitant touch, but with a shadow that moved like a blade through the quiet, sharp, deliberate, cold. Dante Mears stepped into the apartment, his long wool coat brushing the floor, his blonde hair slicked back with a precision that matched the ice in his blue eyes. His jaw was tight, his hands already curling into fists, as if the air itself offended him. He shouldn't have been here. 3 nights ago, Serafina had cut the cord, her voice small but steady, her words a quiet rebellion against the man who'd turned her life into a cage. He'd left then, his silence a threat she couldn't unhear. But Dante didn't let go. Not of her. Not of the control he'd wielded like a weapon. Now, standing in the space she'd reclaimed, he felt the sting of her absence, not just her, but him. His photos were gone, his clothes erased, his cologne discarded. In their place, fairy lights twinkled mockingly, and a dog bed sat where his presence once loomed. A dog. That's what she'd chosen over him. A dog. His gaze fell on the wicker basket, and something twisted inside him, bitter, jagged, alive. Saul stirred faintly, his tail wagging once in his sleep, a reflex to a scent he'd met before but hadn't learned to fear. His round eyes stayed closed, his tiny body trusting the world in a way Dante couldn't fathom. To the puppy, this was home, safe, warm, untouched by the storm brewing in the man above him. But to Dante, Saul was an insult, a golden-furred symbol of everything he'd lost, everything he couldn't bend to his will. His lips curled into a sneer, and the rage he'd carried since Serafina's defiance ignited, burning through reason, through mercy. He stepped closer, his boots clicking against the hardwood, a sound that sliced through the stillness. His shadow fell over the basket, blotting out the fairy light like a cloud swallowing the sun. Saul shifted again, a soft twitch beneath the blanket, but didn't wake, not fully. Dante's hand moved, not with gentleness, not with care, but with a cold, mechanical intent. He reached down and grabbed the puppy by the scruff, his fingers digging into the tender skin as if lifting trash from the curb, something unwanted, something to be discarded. Saul jolted awake, letting out a startled yip, a sound so small it broke the heart of the silence around it. His big eyes blinked open, wide and confused, searching for the warmth he'd known. But there was no warmth in Dante's grip, no kindness in the man who held him aloft. Dante didn't speak. He didn't pause. He slid the balcony door open with a hiss, the cold rushing in like a gasp, and stepped to the edge. The city sprawled below, 14 stories down, a sea of flickering lights and shadowed streets, vast and indifferent. The wind tugged at his coat, but his face remained a mask, carved from stone. Saul trembled in his hand, his tiny body quivering against the chill, against the unknown, and then without a word, without a glance, Dante let go. The puppy fell, a blur of cream and gold against the charcoal sky, a heartbeat tumbling through the night. He didn't flail, didn't cry out, just plummeted, fast and direct, a fragile life swallowed by the dark. The wind howled around him, the city blurring beneath, and for a moment it seemed the world would claim him entirely. 14 stories is a long way to fall, too long for something so small, so new, so innocent. Dante turned, his back to the edge, and slid the door shut with a soft click. He didn't look down, he didn't need to. To him it was done, a message carved in cruelty, a wound left bleeding for Serafina to find. But the night wasn't finished with Saul, not yet. Through the haze, the fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a skeleton of smoke and ash that clung to the night like a ghost, unwilling to let go. 5 blocks south of Williamsburg, in the upper floor of an old Brooklyn bakery, the last embers glowed faintly, their red hearts snuffed beneath the weight of water and time. The wet brick walls gleamed under the pulse of emergency lights, red and blue slicing through the fog that hung heavy in the air, a fog that seemed to have struck a deal with the ash, thick and bitter, coating everything it touched. Orrin Taverner moved through the haze with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this 100 times before, his thick gloves coiling the last of the hose, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the night. At 39, Orrin carried the kind of frame built for burden, physical, emotional, both. His calloused hands bore the scars of years spent pulling life from ruin, and his face, weathered more by experience than age, held a quiet strength beneath close-cropped reddish-brown hair peppered with early grey. A long, pale scar traced beneath his left ear, a jagged reminder of his army days, days he rarely spoke of, though they lingered in the way he stood, alert and grounded, as if the world might shift beneath him at any moment. Among the station crew, he was the calm one, the steady hand in chaos, a man who showed up, did his job, and left without fanfare. But behind his stone-grey eyes, something watched, something that waited for the world to slip, to reveal its next fracture. The fire was done now, the ladder crew climbing down, their boots clanging against metal rungs. Orrin pulled off his mask, letting the bitter, chemical taste of post-fire air flood his lungs. His breath curled into clouds in the cold, rising and dissolving as he stepped away from the truck to check the perimeter one last time. The street stretched quiet before him, wet and glistening, the city's heartbeat softened to a whisper. He adjusted his coat, the weight of it familiar against his aching shoulders, and scanned the darkness. Routine, instinct, a habit carved deep by years of war and flame. And then he saw it. Something fell. No, plummeted. A small blur of pale color cut through the night, a streak against the charcoal sky, too fast to be debris, too alive to be paper. Orin blinked, squinted, his mind racing to make sense of it. It wasn't a sack, not trash tossed from a rooftop party, not anything he'd seen fall before. It moved, alive, fragile, hurtling downward like a comet stripped of its flame. His breath caught, a sharp hitch in his throat, as the blur grew closer, clearer, a cream-colored shape, small and trembling, dropping from the heavens or from hell, straight toward the pavement where he stood. 14 stories up, a shadow had let go. A tiny heartbeat, wrapped in golden fur, flung into the void, without mercy, without reason. Orin didn't know that yet. Not the why, not the who. He only knew what his eyes told him. Something living was falling, and no living thing should fall like that. His instincts screamed before his body obeyed, honed by years of running toward danger when others ran away. The coiled hose slipped from his hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud, and he took 3 long strides, his boots pounding the wet asphalt. The world narrowed, cold air, flashing lights, the rush of his own pulse, and then he dove. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just moved, arms outstretched, chasing a life he couldn't name. The blur was close now, too close, a golden streak against the dark, and his heart pounded with a fear he hadn't felt in years, not for himself, but for whatever was falling into his grasp. The pavement loomed, hard and unforgiving, but he didn't falter. He couldn't, because in that moment, in the space between breaths, he saw it, a puppy, small and golden, tumbling through the night, its tiny body helpless against the wind. Orin's chest tightened, a raw ache blooming behind his ribs. He didn't know its name, didn't know its story, only that it was alive, and that it needed him. The sky gave up its secret, and he lunged into the cold, into the unknown, ready to catch what the world had cast away. A heartbeat caught. The night clung to Brooklyn like a damp shroud, the air thick with the bitter tang of smoke and ash, remnants of a fire that had surrendered to the hoses but left its mark on the streets below. Orin Taverner stood amidst the fading chaos, his broad shoulders squared beneath his fireproof coat, his calloused hands still gripping the coiled hose as the last of the crew retreated from the old bakery. The wet pavement gleamed under the pulse of red and blue lights, reflections trembling with every gust of wind. His stone-grey eyes scanned the perimeter, a habit etched deep by years of war and flame, when something tore through the stillness, a blur, a streak of pale gold plummeting from the sky. It wasn't debris, it wasn't paper or trash flung from a careless hand. It moved, alive, fragile, hurtling downward with a speed that stole the breath from Orin's lungs. He blinked, squinted, his mind scrambling to name it. A small shape, cream against the charcoal night, falling fast, too fast like a comet stripped of its fire. 14 stories up, a shadow had let it go, a tiny heartbeat wrapped in fur cast into the void without mercy. Orin didn't know that yet, didn't know the why or the who. He only knew what his instincts screamed. Something living was falling, and no living thing should meet the ground like that. His heart lurched, a raw ache blooming behind his ribs, and the hose slipped from his grasp, hitting the asphalt with a dull thud. 3 strides. He took 3 long strides, his boots pounding the wet street, the world narrowing to a tunnel of cold air and flashing lights. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He dove, arms outstretched, his body cutting through the night like a blade against the wind. The blur was close now, too close, a golden shape, small and trembling, tumbling through the dark with no sound, no cry, just the silent weight of its descent. The pavement rushed up, hard and unforgiving, but Orin's eyes stayed locked on that streak of life, his pulse roaring in his ears. He hit the ground hard, shoulder first, the jolt searing down his spine as he twisted to shield the fall. His arms closed around something soft, something warm, a sudden weight colliding into his chest, fragile and alive. The impact stole his breath, pain radiating through his bones, but he held on, curling his body around the trembling bundle as it rolled slightly in his grasp. A broken whimper broke the silence, thin and shivering, piercing the haze like a shard of glass. Orin sat up slowly, ignoring the ache in his side, his thick coat falling open as he unwrapped the folds to reveal what he'd caught. A puppy. A golden retriever no more than 10 weeks old lay limp in his lap, its creamy fur smeared with blood, a gash above its brow, a hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Its breathing was shallow, irregular, a fragile thread of life flickering against the cold. Those big, round eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain, searching the face above them for something, safety perhaps, or an answer to the terror it couldn't name. Orin's throat tightened, his rough hands trembling as he cradled the tiny body, its warmth seeping into his palms like a plea. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice cracking with awe, with disbelief barely audible over the wind. The puppy whimpered again, a sound so small it broke something inside him. Something he'd kept locked away for years, behind the scars and the silence. He'd pulled men from burning buildings, dragged a boy from beneath a collapsed ceiling, faced death in ways that left him hollow. But this golden heartbeat, falling from the sky into his arms, stirred a tenderness he didn't know he still had. It wasn't debris. It wasn't trash. It was alive, trembling, trusting him with its last fragile breaths. "Hey, yo, was that a dog?" A voice cut through the moment, sharp and unsteady. Orin turned, his gaze hard, to see a young man, Theo, a stranger with a phone held at an awkward angle, filming from near a parked food truck. Orin didn't answer. He didn't care. His eyes dropped back to the puppy, its blood-streaked fur glowing faintly under the streetlights, and he stood, cradling it like it was made of blown glass. The night stretched on, cold and vast, but in his arms a miracle trembled, a life that shouldn't have survived, caught by hands that couldn't let it fall. A race against the dark. The night pulsed with a strange, fragile energy, the wet Brooklyn streets gleaming under the flicker of streetlights, their amber pools trembling in the wind. Orin Taverner stood amidst the fading echoes of a fire's aftermath, his broad shoulders hunched over the trembling bundle in his arms. The golden retriever puppy, blood-streaked, broken but alive, lay cradled against his chest, its shallow breaths a faint rhythm against the chaos of the moment. Its creamy fur, matted with red from a gash above its brow, glowed faintly in the red-blue wash of emergency lights, and its hind leg dangled limp, a silent cry of pain. Orin's stone-grey eyes locked on the tiny face, those big, glassy eyes staring back, trusting him through a haze of fear and hurt. His throat tightened, a raw ache blooming beneath his ribs, something he hadn't felt in years, something that cracked the armor he'd worn too long. He'd caught him, a heartbeat flung from the sky 14 stories down into arms that shouldn't have been there but were. The pavement still throbbed in his shoulder, the jolt of the dive radiating through his bones. But he didn't care. The puppy whimpered, a thin, shivering sound that sliced through the night, and Orin's hands, calloused, steady, held tighter, as if he could will the little life to hold on. "Hang in there," he murmured, his voice rough with a tenderness he barely recognized. The cold bit at his damp coat, the smoke of the extinguished fire lingering in his lungs, but all he saw was the fragile miracle trembling against him. "Hey, yo, was that a dog?" The voice broke through, sharp and unsteady, pulling Orin's gaze upward. A young man stood near a parked food truck, his faded army green jacket too big for his frame, a knit cap slipping off his head. Theo Morton, 22, a part-time delivery driver with a phone clutched in one hand, filming at an awkward angle. His eyes were wide, his breath puffing into the cold as he stumbled closer, drawn by the rawness of what he'd witnessed. Orin didn't answer, didn't have the words. He turned away, his focus narrowing to the puppy, its warmth seeping into his palms like a plea he couldn't ignore. "You all right, Tavern?" Another voice, gruff and familiar, cut through the haze. Colby, his lieutenant, a wiry man with graying hair and a crooked nose, stepped forward, his skeptical squint softening as he spotted the bundle in Orin's arms. "No," Orin said, already moving, his boots heavy on the asphalt. "I need to borrow the truck." Colby's brow furrowed, glancing at the squirming shape. "That a dog?" "Yeah," Orin muttered, his voice tight. "And he's dying." 10 minutes later, the fire truck's secondary rig, a smaller, battered vehicle used for inspections, rumbled through Brooklyn's dimly lit streets, weaving past brownstones and bare trees bowing under the wind. Orin sat in the back, his coat soaked with sweat and ash, the puppy cradled in a flannel crate they kept for injured cats. Blood smeared the fabric, the gash above the puppy's brow stark against its golden fur, but its chest still rose, still fell, faint, but there. Orin's hands hovered over it, useless now, his heart pounding with a helplessness he hadn't felt since the war. He'd made the call already, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his chest, to someone he hadn't spoken to in months. Dr. Ivy Calder, a veterinarian who ran a late-night clinic on the edge of Park Slope. Ivy's name carried weight, a thread from a past he'd buried. Years ago they'd tried to build something, 6 months of quiet moments and unspoken grief, but he'd been unreachable then, hollowed out by loss she couldn't breach. She'd let him go, her practical strength outlasting his silence, but now he needed her. The truck jolted over a pothole, and the puppy whimpered, its sound piercing Orin like a shard of glass. "Hold on," he whispered, his rough fingers brushing the soft fur, willing it to stay alive. Outside, Theo lingered by the food truck, his phone still in hand. The clip he'd captured, 12 seconds of a cream-colored blur falling, a firefighter's dive, the shout of, "Oh my God, he caught it," was already uploaded to NY Pulse, a local blog he chased stories for. His hands shook as he hit send, the rawness of it sinking in. He didn't know it yet, but within an hour that video would explode. 60,000 views, a ripple spreading through the night, carrying the puppy's fall into the hearts. Esteban's eyes followed it upward. A miracle caught on shaky footage, a story that would soon touch hearts far beyond Brooklyn. But for Orin, none of that mattered. The truck screeched to a stop outside Ivy's clinic, and he stepped out, the puppy in his arms, its trembling body a weight he'd carry as long as it needed him. The night stretched on, cold and vast, but in that moment he was all that stood between life and the dark. A fragile thread. The clinic door swung shut behind Orin Taverner, sealing out the cold bite of the Brooklyn night and wrapping him in the soft hum of fluorescent lights and antiseptic warmth. His boots tracked damp ash across the tile floor, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his soaked fireproof coat, but his arms held steady, cradling the golden retriever puppy like it was the last fragile thing in a world too hard to break. Saul, though Orin didn't know his name yet, trembled against his chest, a tiny heartbeat flickering beneath blood-streaked fur. The gash above the puppy's brow glistened red. His hind leg hung limp, and his shallow breaths rasped in the quiet, a sound so faint it seemed the room itself held its breath to hear it. Dr. Ivy Calder stood at the entrance, her short frame wrapped in scrubs beneath a wool coat, her slippers scuffing the floor instead of shoes. Past midnight, her dark curls were pinned back tightly, a streak of grey cutting through them like a defiant scar, and her eyes, sharp, unshakable, met Orrin's without a word. She didn't need to ask. She saw the bundle in his arms, the blood, the urgency etched into his weathered face, and simply opened the door wider, motioning him inside. The air shifted with her, a calm that didn't waver, a strength forged in the Bronx by a grandmother who'd taught her to stand for those with no voice. Once, years ago, she and Orrin had shared more than this, a fleeting try at something softer, but grief had made him a wall she couldn't climb. Now, she didn't linger on that. She moved, practical and sure, leading him to the padded table under lights that buzzed like tired bees. Orrin laid the puppy down gently, his rough hands hovering as Ivy and her assistant, Malik, took over. Malik, lanky and soft-spoken, moved with a quiet sharpness. 6 months under Ivy's wing had made him steady, unflinching at the sight of blood. He gathered supplies, gauze, saline, a splint, while Ivy's gloved hands traced the puppy's small body, her brow furrowing as she assessed the damage. "Fractured leg," she said, her voice low, clinical but not cold. "Possibly internal bruising. No spinal trauma, thank God. That scratch on his head's shallow, but he's concussed." She pressed gently along his ribs, and the puppy stirred, a faint whimper slipping out, tugging at something deep in Orrin's chest. "He fell," Orrin said, his voice gravelly, still thick with the weight of what he'd seen. "I think from a building. 14 stories, maybe more." Ivy's hand froze for a split second, her dark eyes flicking up to meet his, sharp with disbelief. "From how high?" 14 stories, he repeated, quieter now, the number sinking in. "And he's still alive?" Orrin nodded, barely, his gaze locked on the puppy's trembling form. Ivy's expression softened, her voice dropping to a whisper as she stroked the puppy's ear. "You're a tough little thing, aren't you?" Under the soft light, the puppy stirred again, his big, round eyes fluttering open, glassy, pained, but alive. Ivy worked quickly, her hands steady as she cleaned the gash, Malik passing her tools with silent precision. Orrin leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his damp clothes reeking of ash and adrenaline. He watched, helpless now, as the temporary splint took shape around the puppy's leg, as gauze wrapped his fragile frame. "We'll need X-rays to confirm the full damage," Ivy said, adjusting a heating blanket over him, "but he's stable for now." The puppy's breathing steadied, a fragile rhythm beneath the gauze, and he slipped into a restless sleep, his body half hidden under the warmth. Outside, the world was shifting. Theo Morton's video, 12 seconds of a cream-colored blur falling, Orrin's dive, the shout of "Oh my God, he caught it," had hit NY Pulse and was spreading like wildfire. Within an hour, it amassed over 60,000 views, the comment sections erupting with disbelief, awe, questions. Who was the firefighter? Where did the puppy come from? Was it real? Titled simply "Firefighter Catches Falling Puppy from the Sky," it carried Saul's story beyond the clinic walls, a ripple Orrin didn't yet feel. But inside, none of that reached him. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the lights and the puppy's soft breaths. Ivy cleaned her tools, Malik recorded vitals, and Orrin stayed rooted against the wall, his eyes fixed on the tiny rise and fall of the puppy's chest. He didn't know why this mattered so much, why this small life, plucked from the dark, felt heavier than the men he'd pulled from flames. But it did, and as the night stretched on, that fragile thread of survival held, binding him to a story he couldn't yet see the end of. A name for the light. The fluorescent lights in Ivy Calder's veterinary clinic buzzed low, a soft hum that filled the spaces between breaths, weaving a fragile stillness around the padded recovery bed where the golden retriever puppy lay. Wrapped in thermal fabric, his small body seemed smaller still, splinted legs stiff beneath gauze, head resting on a rolled towel, eyes fluttering beneath a fog of painkillers. The gash above his brow was cleaned now, the blood washed away, but his creamy fur still bore faint streaks of red, a testament to the fall that should have ended him. His chest rose and fell, a shallow rhythm that held the room captive, as if each breath was a thread too thin to trust. Orin Taverner stood at a respectful distance, his broad shoulders slumped against the wall, arms crossed over his damp coat, boots planted like roots in the tile. He hadn't moved much since they'd arrived, his stone-grey eyes fixed on the puppy. Not just on him, but on the empty space above, as if he could still see that blur of gold plummeting through the charcoal sky. 14 stories. The number echoed in his mind, heavy and impossible, a weight he couldn't shake. He'd seen men die from less, soldiers in war zones, civilians in burning wrecks, but this tiny life had defied the odds, landing not on pavement but in his arms. His shoulder ached from the dive, a dull throb pulsing down his spine, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest, something raw, something that stirred beneath the scars he'd carried too long. Ivy leaned over the monitor beside the table, her short frame steady as she reviewed the puppy's vitals. The numbers had stabilized, pulse faint, but holding, breathing uneven. But there, she was barely 5'3", her dark curls pinned back tightly, exposing a jawline carved by grit more than glamour. Her hands moved with a confidence that didn't need words, every gesture sharp and unshakable. She didn't speak much unless it mattered, which made her next words land like stones in still water. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the hum of the lights. Orin turned to her, his expression unreadable, though his grey eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe, or dread. "You sure?" Ivy gave him a sidelong glance, her brow creasing. "You saw the trajectory. You said it wasn't debris. You said he fell, was dropped." Orin exhaled, the word he'd avoided slipping out now. "Thrown. I didn't want to say it till I was sure, but yeah. He wasn't flailing like he slipped. It was deliberate, fast, direct." Ivy nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Then someone meant to kill him?" The words hung there, cold and jagged, slicing through the warmth of the clinic. Orin didn't reply, but his posture shifted, a tightening around his shoulders, a clench in his jaw. He'd seen cruelty before, war zones where men turned to monsters, fires where desperation bred violence, but this hit different. A defenseless puppy, 10 weeks old, tossed from a balcony like trash. It gnawed at him, a nerve he hadn't known was still alive. Maybe it was because the puppy was helpless, or maybe because, like Orin, he hadn't asked to be saved. He looked back at the bed, the puppy stirring faintly under the soft light. A name slipped from his lips, unbidden, quiet as a prayer. "Saul." Ivy glanced up, her practical gaze softening. "Saul?" "Like the sun," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. It was absurd, naming a battered puppy after something so grand, but it felt right. He remembered the warmth that had bloomed in his chest when he'd caught him. Not adrenaline, not luck, but something returning, something he'd lost in the ashes of his past. Ivy gave a small smile, adjusting the monitor on the puppy's chest. "He's got a hell of a story already. Maybe give him something fitting." The room fell quiet again. Malik's pen scratching vitals in the background, the puppy's breaths a fragile metronome. Orin didn't move, his eyes tracing the tiny rise and fall of Saul's ribcage. He'd pulled people from flames, dragged a boy from rubble, faced death in ways that left him hollow. But this falling golden heartbeat, stirred something else, something that had been silent too long. He didn't understand why it mattered so much, but as he watched Saul sleep, he knew one thing: he wasn't walking away. A hollow home. The cold clung to Sarafina Lauren as she pushed open the door to apartment 14B, her arms cradling a small paper bag, oat crackers and almond milk, fragile anchors against the night's weight. The Brooklyn wind had bitten at her thin coat, tugging at her loose braid, but it was nothing compared to the chill that met her inside. The fairy lights still glowed along the balcony window, their soft dance casting a warm halo over the room, but the air felt wrong, too still, too empty, as if the space had exhaled something vital while she'd been gone. Her pale green eyes, sharp with the habit of watching for danger, swept the apartment, searching for the heartbeat she'd left behind. "Saul?" Her voice trembled, soft and uncertain, as she set the bag on the counter. The wicker basket by the balcony sat quiet, the blue knit blanket undisturbed, but no creamy fur peeked out, no oversized paws twitched in sleep. Her chest tightened, a flicker of unease sparking into panic. "Saul?" Louder now, her call echoed off the walls unanswered. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her boots clicking against the hardwood, and knelt beside the basket, her hands digging through the blanket as if he might be hiding beneath it. Nothing. Just the faint warmth of where he'd been, a ghost of the life she'd held so close. She stood, her breath shallow, and turned in a slow circle. The apartment stared back, unchanged, untouched. No mess, no broken glass, just absence. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she rushed to the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, calling his name with a desperation that clawed at her throat. She checked the dryer, absurd, impossible, but she did it anyway, her hands shaking as she yanked the door open, empty. The silence pressed in, heavy and cruel, mocking her with its stillness. Saul, her golden retriever puppy, her light in the dark, was gone. Sarafina sank to the floor, her knees buckling beneath her, the hardwood cold against her palms. Her mind spun. Maybe he'd escaped, slipped out when she'd left, but the door had been closed, hadn't it? She hadn't locked it. She remembered now, the oversight slicing through her like a blade, but closed, surely. Or had it? Doubt gnawed at her, and then something darker pulled, a shadow she couldn't ignore. Dante. He still had a key. She hadn't changed the locks, hadn't found the strength to erase him completely. His violence had always been aimed at her, words that cut, control that bruised. But what if he'd come back? What if he'd taken Saul to hurt her? Tears stung her eyes, but they didn't fall, not yet. She stumbled to her feet, grabbing her phone from the counter, its buzz a lifeline in the chaos. A flyer. She'd make a flyer, post it online, find him. Her fingers fumbled as she typed, her vision blurring, lost, golden retriever puppy, 10 weeks old, cream fur, cinnamon stripe. She hit send, scattering it across every local forum, her breath hitching with each click. Then a trending tag caught her eye. Dog Savior. She tapped it without thinking, and the video loaded mid-motion. Shaky phone footage, a cream-colored blur falling from the sky, a firefighter diving, the sound of impact, a shout, "Oh my God, he caught it." "Oh my!" Her heart stopped. She paused the frame, the grainy image punching the air from her lungs. That cinnamon stripe, those oversized paws, the tiny smudge on his left front leg. It was Saul. Her Saul, tumbling through the night, helpless, alone. The phone slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor as her knees gave out again. Her breath came in gasps, shallow and ragged, as the loop replayed in her mind, his little body falling, no wings, no reason, just falling. And then the memory struck, small but piercing, their second night together, his whimper in the dark, her lifting him into bed, his nose nudging her neck as she cried. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she'd whispered, laughing through tears. A buzz snapped her back, a message from her friend Mika. "Calder Veterinary Care, Park Slope. I think he's there." Sarafina's hands shook as she dialed, her voice breaking when a man answered. "My name's Sarafina. I saw the video, the puppy, the golden retriever. I think that's my dog." A pause, a click, then a woman's voice, confident and calm. "This is Dr. Ivy Calder. Describe him for me." "Golden retriever, 10 weeks old, cream fur, cinnamon line down his back, black smudge on his left front leg. He's quiet, doesn't bark, startles at sirens." A long beat of silence, then Ivy's reply. "That matches. He's here. He survived the fall." Relief crashed through her, cracking something loose in her chest. "Is he okay?" "He's stable," Ivy said carefully. "Some trauma, but alert. He's resting." Sarafina squeezed her eyes shut, tears spilling now. "I'm coming." She hung up, her coat still carrying Saul's faint scent as she pulled it on, her keys trembling in her hand. The hollow home faded behind her as she stepped into the night, momentum driving her toward the light she'd lost and the hope she might reclaim. A heart returned. The wind howled down the narrow streets of Park Slope, clawing at the windows of Dr. Ivy Calder's veterinary clinic as Sarafina Lauren stepped inside, the soft jingle of the door a fragile note against the storm outside. The cold clung to her thin coat, her dark braid wind-blown and fraying, but the warmth of the lobby wrapped around her like a hesitant embrace. She clutched the coat closed, her pale green eyes sweeping the modest space. White tile floors, clean grey walls, a row of glossy plants defying the endless winter. Her breath trembled in her chest, a tight knot of fear and hope she couldn't untangle as she approached the reception desk. A teenage girl with a buzz cut and chipped blue nail polish looked up, offering a hesitant smile. "I'm here for Saul," Sarafina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're his owner?" the girl asked, blinking. Sarafina nodded, her throat too tight for more words. The girl stood, disappearing through a door with a quick, "Wait here, Dr. Calder's expecting you." Alone now, Sarafina stood frozen, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. The antiseptic smell of healing stung her nose, mingling with the memory of Saul's faint scent, warm fur, cinnamon, trust, still lingering on her coat from the days he'd napped in her lap. She'd lost him, left him to a cruelty she couldn't fathom, and the weight of that failure pressed down, threatening to buckle her knees again. The door creaked open and Ivy Calder stepped through, her short frame exuding a quiet authority. Her dark curls were pinned back, her scrubs practical beneath a wool coat, and her eyes, sharp, unflinching, met Sarafina's with a professional calm. "You must be Sarafina," she said, her smile measured but kind. "Yes," Sarafina replied, the words spilling out too fast. "Saul, he's okay?" Ivy nodded, tilting her head slightly. "He's stable, alert, a little bruised, but healing better than expected. He's a tough one." Relief broke through Sarafina like a dam cracking, her exhale sharp and shaky. "You can see him," Ivy added. "He's in the observation room." They walked in silence down a narrow hallway, framed photos of healed animals, smiling dogs, bandaged cats, lining the walls like quiet promises. Ivy pushed open the last door on the left, and there he was, Saul, her Saul, lying on a padded recovery bed, wrapped in a fleece blanket patterned with tiny bones. His splinted leg jutted out awkwardly, his head rested on a rolled towel, but his ears twitched as she entered, those floppy golden ears she'd traced with her fingers just days ago. His big, round eyes opened blurry and wide, locking onto hers, and a slow, aching whine slipped from his throat, tugging at her heart like a thread unraveling.
"Saul," she whispered, stepping forward, her voice flooding with tears she couldn't hold back. His tail stirred beneath the blanket, too weak to lift, but then he moved, his front legs scrambling against the padding, his body trembling as he tried to rise, clumsy and pained but desperate to reach her. "Easy," she choked out, crouching beside him, her hands shaking as she stroked his head.
He leaned into her touch, letting out a deep, broken sigh, pure relief, ancient and animal, a sound that said he'd found her again. "I missed you," she murmured, burying her face in the blanket beside him, his nose pressing against her arm. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. I didn't—" Her voice shattered, tears soaking the fleece as she clung to him, her hands never leaving his fur. Ivy watched from the doorway, her expression softening, a flicker of something unguarded breaking through her practical shell. She'd seen too many emergencies, too many farewells, to let emotion pierce her often, but this small miracle of reunion, knocked gently at her guarded heart. She stepped back into the hall, giving them space, and found Orrin Taverner leaning against the opposite wall, his broad frame still, his grey eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his damp hair. He'd come earlier to check on the puppy, the one he'd named Saul, but stayed when he'd heard Serafina was coming. Now, watching her through the doorway, crouched, broken, pouring her grief into the dog she loved, something shifted in his chest, a quiet ache he couldn't name. "She loves that dog," Ivy said softly, joining him. Orrin nodded once, his jaw tight. "Did you see her arms?" Ivy asked, her voice dropping lower. "What?" She kept pulling her sleeves down. "I caught a glimpse, purple bruises, fresh, circular, fingers." Orrin's body tensed, a slow burn igniting behind his ribs. He'd seen bruises like that before, on civilians in war zones, on women pulled from burning homes, marks that weren't accidents. "I'm guessing this wasn't just about the dog," Ivy said, her gaze steady. "If she's living with someone who'd do that to a 10-week-old puppy, I don't think Saul was the only one in danger." Orrin didn't reply, his eyes still on Serafina, her raw grief spilling out unashamed. "She say anything to you?" Ivy pressed. "No," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." Inside, Serafina whispered soft promises into Saul's blanket, her tears mingling with his fur, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to fade. Orrin watched, rooted to the wall, knowing some wounds didn't speak until they were ready, and some needed someone brave enough to listen. A reckoning in the shadows. The fire station loomed against the Brooklyn night, its brick facade weathered and steady, a bulwark of light piercing the grey haze that clung to the streets. Inside, the air smelled of diesel and ash, the faint hum of a television flickering through the bay, where Engine 224 sat gleaming, freshly washed, after the bakery blaze. Orrin Taverner leaned against the truck's ladder, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his stone-grey eyes alert, tracing the grain of the concrete floor. He'd come back from the clinic an hour ago, leaving Saul, the golden retriever puppy he'd caught from the sky, in Serafina's trembling arms. Her tear-streaked face lingered in his mind, her quiet strength tangled with a fragility he couldn't unsee. And those bruises Ivy had whispered about gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't reach. The station was quiet now, the crew scattered, some sleeping upstairs, others grabbing coffee from the machine that growled like an old dog. Orin stayed below, restless, his calloused hands tracing the edge of a wrench he didn't need. He didn't know why he lingered, only that something unfinished hung in the air, thick and expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then the bay door rattled, a sharp clang cutting through the stillness, and a shadow stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a purpose that felt like a blade unsheathed. Dante Mears didn't belong here. His long wool coat swept the floor, damp from the drizzle outside, and his blonde hair, slicked back, glistened under the fluorescent lights. His ice-blue eyes glinted with a wildness Orin recognized, rage teetering on the edge of control, a man unraveling. "You the guy?" Dante's voice sliced through the quiet, sharp and unsteady, his jaw clenched tight. Orin straightened, his frame solid against the truck, his expression unreadable. "Depends who you're looking for," he said, low and even, the calm before a wave crashes.
"You caught the dog," Dante spat, stepping closer, his boots clicking against the concrete. "That mutt, her mutt. You stuck your nose where it didn't belong." Orin's eyes narrowed, the pieces clicking into place, Serafina's soul, the fall, the bruises. This was the shadow behind it all, the cruelty that had flung a 10-week-old puppy from 14 stories up. "That dog's alive because of me," Orin said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "You got a problem with that?"
Dante's laugh was harsh, a jagged thing that echoed off the walls. "You don't get it. She's mine. Her, that apartment, everything. She doesn't get to walk away." His hands balled into fists, trembling with a fury he couldn't contain, and then he lunged, fast, sloppy, aiming a wild swing at Orin's jaw. Orin sidestepped, years of instinct kicking in, and caught Dante's arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that was all muscle, no hesitation. Dante roared, thrashing like a trapped animal, but Orin held firm, pinning him against the truck's cold metal frame. "You're done," Orin growled, his voice a low rumble as he pressed Dante's cheek to the ladder. Footsteps pounded down the stairs. Colby and two others, roused by the commotion, their shouts sharp in the chaos. "Call it in," Colby barked, and within minutes, sirens wailed closer, blue lights flooding the bay as NYPD officers spilled inside. Dante snarled, spitting curses as cuffs snapped around his wrists, his rage crumbling into desperation. "She'll never be rid of me!" he shouted, his voice cracking as they dragged him toward the cruiser, his coat trailing like a fallen flag. Outside, beyond the station's glow, Serafina stood in the drizzle, her thin coat soaked through, her pale green eyes wide as she watched from the shadows of a parked car. She'd followed a hunch, Dante's key missing from her drawer, his threats ringing in her ears, and arrived just as the storm broke. Her breath caught, a sob swallowed by the rain, as she saw him, handcuffed, defeated, his power stripped away. Relief washed over her, cold and sharp, mingling with the ache of years spent under his shadow. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, invisible, as the cruiser pulled away, taking the nightmare with it. Orin stepped to the bay door, wiping a smear of blood from his knuckles. Dante's wild swing had grazed him after all. His grey eyes scanned the dark, landing on her silhouette across the street, faint but unmistakable. She met his gaze for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement, then turned into the night, her braid swaying as she walked away. Inside, his phone buzzed, his sister Celeste, her voice bright through the static. "Hey, can you watch Becca tomorrow? I've got a shift."
He exhaled, grounding himself. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be there." The rain fell harder, but for the first time in hours, the air felt lighter.
A light rebuilt. The Brooklyn spring crept in slow and soft, a fragile thaw softening the edges of a winter that had clung too long. Inside Dr. Ivy Calder's veterinary clinic, the air hummed with the quiet rhythm of healing, antiseptic mingling with the faint musk of fur, the fluorescent lights casting a gentle glow over the recovery room. Saul lay stretched across a padded bed, his golden retriever frame no longer so small, though still delicate beneath the scars of his fall. The splint was gone now, his hind leg bearing weight with a tentative grace, and the gash above his brow had faded to a thin pink line, barely visible against his creamy fur. His cinnamon swirl curled down his back like a promise kept, and his big round eyes, once glassy with pain, now sparkled with a cautious wonder, following every shadow that danced across the room. Sarafina Lauren sat beside him, her slender frame folded into a chair, too stiff for comfort, her pale green eyes tracing his every breath. Her thick black hair hung loose today, spilling over her shoulders in waves she hadn't bothered to tame, and her hands rested lightly on his head, fingers threading through his fur as if to anchor herself to his warmth. The bruises on her arms had faded, purple to yellow to nothing, but the memory of them lingered, a quiet weight she carried beneath her oversized sweater. Dante was gone, locked away after that night at the fire station, his threats silenced by bars and time. Yet freedom felt fragile, a gift she was still learning to trust, and Saul was her tether to it. Her light returned, her reason to keep going. Across the room, Orin Taverner leaned against the wall, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his grey eyes watchful, tracing the scene with a stillness that belied the storm he'd weathered to bring them here. His fireproof coat hung on a hook by the door, replaced by a faded flannel that softened his edges, though the scar beneath his ear still gleamed faintly, a jagged reminder of battles past. He'd been coming by the clinic more often these weeks, checking on Saul, bringing coffee for Ivy, exchanging quiet words with Sarafina that grew less guarded each time. She'd started smiling at him, small, fleeting smiles that caught him off guard, stirring something warm beneath the armor he'd worn too long. Ivy bustled in, her practical energy filling the space as she set a clipboard on the counter. "He's cleared," she said, her voice bright with a rare grin. "Legs strong, lungs are clear. He's ready to go home." Sarafina's breath hitched, her hand pausing in Saul's fur. "Home," she echoed, the word tasting new, untainted. Ivy nodded, then glanced between them, her sharp eyes catching the unspoken thread weaving through the room. "You two did good by him," she said, softer now. "Not many would have fought this hard." The idea had come later, born in the quiet hours after Dante's arrest, when Sarafina couldn't sleep and Orin couldn't shake the image of Saul falling. The Sky Dog Project, a non-profit to rescue animals from cruelty, to give them the chance Saul had been given. Ivy had jumped in, her clinic a hub for triage, while Malik designed flyers and Theo, whose video had sparked it all, spread the word online. It was small yet, just a handful of volunteers and a rented space near the station, but it felt like a seed taking root, a way to turn pain into purpose. Sarafina looked up at Orin, her gaze steady, unguarded. "You named him Saul," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Sunlight, it fits." Orin shifted, a flush creeping up his neck. "Seemed right," he murmured, his voice low. "He's got a way of lighting things up." She nodded, her fingers brushing Saul's ears, and for a moment their eyes held, a quiet understanding, a shared wound beginning to heal. It wasn't love, not yet, but something gentler, a trust, blooming in the spaces where fear had once lived. Saul stirred, his tail thumping softly against the bed, and Sarafina laughed, a sound light and free, the first Orin had heard from her. "He's ready," she said, standing, her hand lingering on his fur as she clipped a leash to his collar. Orin stepped forward, offering a steady arm as Saul tested his legs, his gait wobbly but determined. "We'll take it slow," he said, and she nodded, grateful for the for the quiet promise it carried. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, the sky breaking open to a tentative blue. The Skydog Project's first crate of supplies waited at the new space. A beginning, a chance to catch what others let fall. Serafina glanced at Orin, Saul trotting between them, and felt the weight lift just a little. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time it felt like hers to walk. A sky full of grace. The Brooklyn air carried the first true breath of summer, warm and golden, as if the city itself had exhaled the last of its winter ghosts. On a quiet street near the fire station, a small crowd gathered outside a freshly painted storefront, its sign gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Skydog Project. The building was modest, red brick, wide windows, a door flung open to welcome the curious, but it buzzed with a life that felt larger than its walls. Volunteers in matching teal shirts darted about, carrying crates of leashes and bowls, while a local band strummed a gentle tune from the sidewalk, their notes weaving through the chatter. At the center of it all stood Saul, his golden retriever fur shimmering like sunlight itself, a living testament to survival. He was stronger now, his once fragile frame filled out with muscle and mischief, though his hind leg bore a faint limp, a quiet scar from the night he'd fallen 14 stories into Orin Taverner's arms. The cinnamon swirl down his back glowed against his creamy coat, and his big, round eyes sparkled with a joy that defied the pain he'd known. A teal bandana hung loosely around his neck, embroidered with the Skydog logo, a silhouette of a puppy mid-leap against a sky-blue circle, and he trotted through the crowd with a wagging tail, nudging hands that reached to pet him, his presence a magnet for smiles and whispered awe. Serafina Lauren stood beside him, her slender frame steady in a simple white dress that caught the breeze, her thick black hair spilling free over her shoulders. Her pale green eyes shimmered with a light she'd thought lost forever, tracing the faces around her, volunteers, donors, neighbors, who'd come to celebrate what she and Orin had built. The Skydog Project wasn't just a shelter. It was a promise, a lifeline for animals cast aside, a way to stitch meaning into the wounds Dante had left. He was gone now, locked away, his shadow shrinking with each day she reclaimed, but the echoes of his cruelty had birthed this, a place where no creature would fall alone. Orin Taverner lingered near the entrance, his broad shoulders relaxed in a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, his grey eyes soft, as he watched Serafina and Saul weave through the crowd. The scar beneath his ear caught the sunlight, a jagged line that spoke of battles past, but his face held something new, peace, tentative and hard-won. He'd been there every step, hauling crates, painting walls, his quiet strength a ballast when Serafina's doubts crept in. They'd grown close these months, not with grand gestures but with shared silences, late-night talks over coffee, a trust that felt like coming home. The ribbon-cutting came at dusk, the sky streaking pink and gold as Ivy Calder handed Serafina the scissors. "You earned this," Ivy said, her practical grin softening with pride. Serafina's hands shook as she snipped the teal ribbon, the crowd's cheers washing over her like a tide, and Saul barked, a bright, clear sound that broke her into a laugh. She knelt beside him, burying her face in his fur, whispering, "We made it."
Orin stepped closer, his hand brushing her shoulder. Not a claim, but a presence. And when she stood, their eyes met, a quiet vow passing between them.
Later, they returned to apartment 14B, the place where it had all begun. The fairy lights still glowed along the balcony window, casting their familiar halo, but the air felt different, lighter, cleansed. Serafina stood at the edge, staring down 14 stories to the street below, The memory of Saul's fall, a dull ache she could finally face. Orin joined her, his breath steady beside her, and when she turned to him, her voice was soft but sure. "I thought I'd lose everything here." He shook his head, his hand finding hers, warm and calloused. "You didn't. You built something instead." He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Not a beginning, but a moment, and she closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle. Saul nosed between them, his tail thumping the floor, and Seraphina smiled, the sound of his joy a melody she'd carry forever. The Skydog project was open, a beacon born from darkness, and as the city hummed below, she felt it. Love, grace, a second chance, whispered in every heartbeat around her. Sometimes, she thought, the angels came with fur, sent to catch us when we didn't know we were falling.